preparing for the Mass this evening, wondering how to tie the Gospel reading in with the life and the meaning of Geoffrey Chaucer, particularly on this occasion that the fervent, faithful disciple of Geoffrey Chaucer, our dear friend Dolores Cullen, has left us and gone home to her reward. What is Jesus trying to tell us right now? It dawned on me as I was looking through my favorite source of quick reference material, Wikipedia. They do have an excellent section on Geoffrey Chaucer. It's a little bit lacking, though, in Chaucer's relationship to Christianity. Maybe I can pull together a little bit of Dolores' writings and supplement that, since the peer review for Wikipedia is essentially everybody. And there's a lot of checks and balances to kind of keep the kooks out, hopefully, or at least keep them in mind. Anyway, Wikipedia is another subject. One of the things that dawned on me was that this man, who is universally regarded as the father of English literature in English, that is, from England, in the context of the English world at that time, in the 14th century, that he was not by profession a scholar or a writer. That was probably his hobby, which he engaged in more and more late in life. Now, of course, what do we call people who have a hobby that they're passionate about? We call them amateurs, don't we? And what is an amateur? An amateur is one who does what he or she does out of love. The root of the word amateur is one who loves. I'm not so sure what that always says about the professionals and the academics and those people, but we do know where the heart of the amateur is. But what was Chaucer's profession? How did he make a living? He identifies himself as a vintner. Now, I looked a little bit deeper and discovered that in London in his day, vintner was not one who made wine. A vintner was one who sold wine, or rather was the middleman importing the wine from the places where they grew grapes and made wine, which was not England. They don't have enough sun to get any kind of sugar in the grapes. So imported wine and then sold it to the people, to the pubs and to the various stores that people bought wine from. And at the time of Chaucer, vintners, wine merchants, were among the wealthiest of the non-noble class. So he came from a wealthy family, and he was engaged in a very profitable trade. He was obviously very, very astute and very intelligent, because early on he was called into public service. And he became what we like to call sometimes, most of the time maybe, unapprovingly, he became a bureaucrat. In fact, his profession was to be a professional bureaucrat. A civil servant working for the government, but of course the government meant the king. And the government meant all of those officials around the king who were answerable to the king. And as a bureaucrat, he did quite a bit of traveling. He became very acquainted with the culture of other countries in Europe, all of whom were run by kings, except parts of Italy were run by the Pope, who was the king of the Papal States. And most of the time, they were fighting with one another. Or they were negotiating peace treaties with one another, trying to always get the advantageous position. And Geoffrey Chaucer was really right in the middle of all of the diplomacy that being an ambassador, a civil servant, a public servant, a king's servant, a bureaucrat entailed. He was also a rather pious, devout layman. He knew his religion. But more than that, he knew Jesus Christ. And that is what makes, if you're at all familiar with Dolores Cullen's research, that's what makes her research so very special. Because she very astutely and very rightly, I think, identifies the host of the Canterbury Tales as being Christ. And the various pilgrims represent a lot of things. But one of the things that's most obvious that they represent are the various kinds of people of society, and particularly the various kinds of people of the church. And guess what? None of them are doing what they should be doing. They were all corrupt. That's maybe one reason why a lot of what Chaucer had to say had to be cloaked in humor and in figures of speech, metaphors, allegory, and so on. Because what he was saying about God and Jesus Christ and the church was not necessarily very pleasing to a lot of people of power. So he had to kind of couch what he was saying in terms that would enable his head to stay connected with his body. And apparently he did that fairly successfully, although there are some theories based on some circumstantial evidence that Chaucer himself may have been murdered. But be that as it may, he was right in the middle of a lot of controversy. But what he was a professional merchant and bureaucrat living in the world, trying to make his way through the world with some degree of integrity. Because as we all know, and certainly in current events, it's pretty obvious that those who deal with the relationships with other countries often do shady deals and things that are not necessarily, well, they're the sort of thing that if they cared about it, they should go to confession for. But guess what? That's the way things were then as well as now. Things tend not to change. So Chaucer, I think, in many ways, poured his soul and his heart into this seemingly bawdy mishmash of stories that hid a very deep treasure. Now, in the Gospel, we've got the professional religious guy, the Pharisee. And he knew that he was religious. And by God, he was proud of it. And he didn't hesitate to tell the Lord how much he was doing for God. And when he was finished with his prayer, which was a monologue, no evidence that he was listening to God, he goes home, unchanged. The tax collector was a bureaucrat who, most of them, made liberal use of the opportunities to cheat people in their role as public officials. And what did he do? He stayed off in the corner. Basically, he did the equivalent of going to confession. And he simply beat his breast and said, Lord, be merciful to me. I am a sinner. I am a sinner. And Jesus says, he went home, justified, forgiven, healed. Now, I have to confess, Dolores, that I have not yet managed to read all of the Canterbury Tales in translation, much less in Middle English. But I have read the introduction and the conclusion, which is called the retraction. And the retraction that Chaucer wrote is sort of it's a plea for his reader to pray for him. That's how he ends the Canterbury Tales. You who are reading this, pray for me. Pray for me to the Lord Jesus, to his Holy Mother, to all the saints and the angels. I mean, he really sounded almost desperate. That my sins may be forgiven. That whatever I have done wrong may not be held against me. That I may enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's pretty clear that he had a faith that was deep enough and strong enough to publicly ask us, more than 6 centuries later, to pray for him. That is what gave Dolores Cullen the idea to, on the 600th anniversary of his death, which was October 25th, as in yesterday, October 25th, 2000, 600 years to the day after Chaucer died, she wanted a Mass offering for the repose of the soul, because that's what he asked for. And I suggested, well, why don't we make it a little public thing? Why don't we have some medieval music to go with us? Why don't we have a party afterwards with mead and all kinds of goodies and wine? Actually, I don't know if Chaucer ever actually drank mead, because we do know that he was given by one of the kings a bequest, a gift of 1 gallon of wine per day. Yeah, not too shabby. So, and apparently he did something to earn that. But at any rate, he looked back on his life. And don't know if you look back on his life as a writer and, I did all of these bawdy things and wrote about them and all of that, and I need to ask forgiveness, or if he recognized that as a bureaucrat at the service of the king, dealing in relationships with all of these other bureaucrats of other kings, trying to sort of bring peace, but more often trying to work towards our benefit rather than your benefit, if that perhaps was something he had to confess and say, I need forgiveness. So it could very well be that the tax collector in Jesus' parable is an image that Chaucer may have had in his mind when he was writing those words. It's an interesting thought and an interesting parallel. Now, there's a couple of takeaways. I always like to end a homily. You know that when I get to the takeaways, the end may be there. Maybe there. One of the takeaways is do what you need to do to make your way through this life. And that means your profession may not always be the thing that you love, but it may be something that you're good at. Don't scorn that. Embrace it. But don't let that get in the way of what you love. And Chaucer obviously loved his language enough to be able to write well and inventively in the spoken and just barely written tongue of his language. I don't think he ever thought that 600 years later he would be studied and analyzed and regarded as the father of English literature, because that was just his hobby. He was just an amateur. But look what happened. The other takeaway is, let's remember, like the Pharisee and the tax collector, that we don't get through this life unsullied. We all have plenty of things that we need to say, Lord, have mercy, I'm a sinner. So Chaucer is an example. The tax collector in the gospel is an example. I think we need to learn from that example the gift of humble contrition, which frees us then to go forth forgiven